Thank you so much for coming. Good evening, everybody, and hello to everybody watching online in the live stream. So as we start, we are asked to share our first memorable word or popular cultural works in our journey of studying Japanese. And although this is a session about literature, I did choose a work of manga to share with you today. In the English-speaking world, this might not be the most widely known series, but as a kid, a favorite of mine was a series called Captain Tsubasa, as you can see here on the screen. And it's about a child football prodigy who, despite his talent, practiced very hard to become the very best footballer in his town. And then with his teammates became the very best team in Japan and then in the entire world. Now, I don't play football myself, unfortunately, but one quality that I really admire in the main character, Ozora Tsubasa, is his amazing ability to make friends with the people he's playing football with, be it his teammates or his opponents. This came as no wonder years later when I started learning Japanese and I realized that the word Tsubasa means wings in Japan. So there you go. In addition, since we are discussing translation today, there is also an interesting translation episode. You see, the surname of the main character is Ozora, and the first kanji character here can also be pronounced as Dai. And in the process of localization, that means adapting the series to a local context, such as Hong Kong, where I grew up, the characters were given Cantonese-sounding names. But because the first kanji character is not a usual surname, the translator had perhaps picked another character that both acts as a surname and it's pronounced as Dai in Cantonese in order to maintain this linguistic link with Japanese. So for those of you who study Japanese, you might recognize this more difficult kanji character as well. Indeed, this is similarly pronounced as Tai or Dai in Japanese, such as in the honorific chodai shimasu, meaning to receive humbly. And when I went back to Hong Kong for the winter holidays, I took a picture of my massive collection of this series. As you can see here, I was very into it when I was a kid. Anyway, this was one of the first moments I got interested into Japanese culture and language. And here I am years later to share with you something about Japanese literature today. Now, if you're interested in Japanese literature, you've been in a very happy place right now. Whether it is a whole ceiling to floor bookshelf of Japanese literature that I took at a local Waterstones bookshop, or the fact that Yuzuki Asako's Butter, translated by Polly Barton, won Waterstones Book of the Year in 2024, or therefore even having your birthday cake made according to the novel's cover. I took this at the local bakery in Crouch End in North London. And for those who don't know, Butter is a novel where women kill men. So I'm not so sure who's getting the cake, for the birthday, but whatever it is, you only need to pop by your nearest bookstore to find yourself surrounded by an abundance of Japanese novels in English translation, like I did here, taking all the pictures of their covers. Now, in my little short introduction in the coming 17 minutes I would like to contextualize this recent rise in the popularity of Japanese novels. How did this come about? And what does it mean for the study of literature and translation? This session is supposed to explore how translated Japanese literature can allow us to understand Japanese society and language more. And this, of course, is a huge question that many literary scholars would spend their entire career answering and doing research on. So while I'll paint some broad strokes today, I'll also want to make the point that studying this recent trend doesn't only teach us about Japanese culture, but something about the current times we live in as well. I begin with what I call the 3 approximate waves of translated Japanese fiction. Now, this title alone needs some unpicking. I'm focusing on fiction today because that is the most translated genre. And B, these waves are really approximations, which means that while we can identify some general tendencies, I'm by no means suggesting that these are definitive. So for example, as you can see here, the first wave is identified as starting in the 50s, going on all the way till the 80s. But that does not mean that before the 50s, there was no Japanese literature translated into English. Of course there was. So once you get into universities and start studying this topic in a more intellectual manner, then you'll be able to discover nuances and exceptions that, to be honest, is even more interesting. Now, having said that, we could see that the first surge in translated Japanese novels was in the 1950s, culminating around three authors whom we've come to call the big three. That's Tanizaki Junichiro, Kawabata Yasunari, who is, of course, Japan's first winner in the Nobel Prize for Literature, and Mishima Yukio. All three writers and their works have been translated and have garnered much attention and popularity. Other writers, of course, do get translated too, such as Akutagawa Ryunosuke, Abe Kobo, and the other Nobel laureate, Oe Kenzaburo. Given that this happened right after the Second World War, it came as little surprise that many notable translators in this period were Japanologists with an army background, having worked in the US Army or Navy, often as interpreters. Such was the case with many of the names that are listed here, such as Howard Strauss, Edward Sutton Sticker, Donald Keene, Michael Gallagher, Ivan Morris, and others. Howard Strauss, in particular here, was the visionary who persuaded the American publishing company Alfred K. Knopf to publish a wealth of translated Japanese novels by the big three writers. Some of the covers from back in time you can see here on the screen. The second wave took place in the 1990s and the noughties. And this was a time when, thanks to the interest that Japan was attracted, Japan has been able to attract in the English-speaking world, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Australia, many universities have established Japanese studies program and departments, often with modules on Japanese literature. Hence, many of the translators in this period, such as J. Rubin, Philip Gabriel, Stephen Snyder, Michael Emmerich, and David Karashima, they're all based in such similar Japanese programs in universities. Apart from the classics, they were also interested in translating more contemporary writers, and that's how, for example, Murakami Haruki came into widespread attention following a full house conference panel in the 1992 Association for Asian Studies conference. Now, together with Murakami, there were other, again, writers being translated as well. Yoshimoto Banana, who in fact was translated earlier into English than Murakami. There's also Kirino Natsuo and also Ogawa Yoko, etc. Murakami, no doubt, has become the forerunner of this wave. And we can spend days talking about how he came to be so popular. But after almost 5 decades of writing, Murakami has now gained a new role in the Japanese literary circle, either as an ambassador of Japanese literature, as seen by the fact that here on the right, he wrote the introduction to the Penguin Book of Japanese Short Stories published in 2018, introducing more recent writers to the English-speaking world. Or that he, on the right, donated many of his manuscripts to the Waseda International House of Literature, therefore nicknamed the Haruki Murakami Library. This library, located in the campus of Waseda University in Tokyo, also houses a lot of literary events featuring collaborations between writers and other artists. On the topic of collaboration, Murakami is now also known for his support of emerging writers, such as the various talks that he has done with Kawakami Miyako, whom we'll return to later, and even publishing a book that recorded an extended conversation between himself and Kawakami Miyako. And with that, this brings us to the third current wave of translated Japanese fiction. Now, I believe a main background for this is that in the Anglophone book market, there are certain infrastructures in development currently in the last 10 years, particularly the International Booker Prize, which is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year, but which of course had already existed before then. But long story short, we now have a big boom in sales and popularity in translated fiction, as you can see here in this Guardian coverage. And in fact, industry data would reveal that Japanese fiction consistently contribute to at least 25% of these sales, with some years even rising to nearly half of the sales. But what actually has been translated? I think one notable genre is something that we are pretty familiar with, and that is this heartwarming mode of fiction, the iyashike in Japanese. And as you can see here, a lot of cats, a lot of coffee shops, a lot of bookstores, almost stereotypical, but basically lighthearted, feel-good stories that bring us significant peace in what for some people would be particularly turbulent times right now. But if these form a solid foundation readership for Japanese literature, then they also helped open the door to newer modes of Japanese fiction to be translated into English. For example, we see more speculative works being translated, especially crime and mystery, of which, in fact, Japan has a long tradition on, and thus virtually has an unlimited supply of works, making them sometimes even more popular than some of the more highbrow writing. Amidst this trend, and because the book industry is constantly looking to create new towering figures that can represent the group of literature, we particularly see high-profile publications by two writers. That's Kawakami Miyako, whom we've seen earlier, and also Murata Sayaka, the author of the famous novel Convenience Store Women, and very much known for her unique characters. Now, their works are consistently translated and published, thus indicating a much wider market reception. But as opposed to translators with a military background or working in academia, as we saw in the first two waves, a key difference this time we've noticed is how certain infrastructures are coming into place to cultivate more translators. Examples include the British Centre for Literary Translation, which organized a literary translation summer school Japanese workshop between 2010 and 2013 at the University of East Anglia. This helped build both skills and community among the new generation of translators, such as Jeannie Tapley Takemori, Asa Yoneda, Lucy North, Polly Barton, Morgan Giles, David Boyd, and many others. Other seasoned translators include Alison Markin Powell and also our very own Joanna Sensei this evening. Mentioning Joanna Sensei means that we must also mention the Japanese International Translation Competition, now in its 11th installment this year, and sponsored by the government of Japan. Joanna Sensei is also a key member of JNet, which is a specialist network of Japanese translators under the UK's Institute of Translation and Interpreting. The availability of this infrastructure, giving rise to a growing number of translators and therefore the number of works translated, has meant that translators now have a bigger say than before in deciding what gets translated. Therefore, one key feature in this third wave that we're in right now is that it is partially translator-driven. Jeannie Tapley Takemori, Lucy North, and Alison Markin Powell, for example, have co-founded the Strong Women Soft Power Network, which organizes literary events that promote particularly the work of women writers from Japan. And this translates into, no pun intended, another characteristic in this third wave, which is that there is a marked increase in female writers being translated into English. This is not only thanks to translators suggesting more female writers to be translated, but it's also because in Japan too, female writers are slowly gaining a bit more recognition than before. Among the Japanese authors that get translated into English recently, many of them are winners of the Akutagawa Prize, Japan's most high-profile literary prize for new writers. And thanks to the work of scholars such as Chieko Ariga, we can see that from the prize's inception in 1935 up until 1979, only 15% of the winners were women. Between 1980 and 2010, however, that figure rose to a little more than 40%. And if we now update this statistics to 2010 to 2024, it's now very close to half and half. A few weeks ago, they announced the 2025 winners, and the winners were two male writers. So now the tally technically becomes 20 to 20. But the idea is not to say that we must maintain a strict gender balance every time the prize is awarded. The point is that works by female writers are beginning to be evaluated on a fairer level. Therefore, to dig a little deeper, it is not only a question of which gender wins, but also who holds the power of interpretation and translation. In the realm of interpretation, at least, Ariga has pointed out almost 30 years ago that in Japan, novels usually come with a commentary that's published at the end called kaisetsu. And at the time of Ariga's writing, about 95% of commentaries for women novels were written by male writers or critics. Now, this has changed since, and we now have seen more commentaries penned by female writers or critics. And certainly in the area of education as well, the current gender split of the judges for the Akugawa Prize is an encouraging 5 men and 4 women. All of these developments, I'm saying, should be read in tandem with the current third wave of translated Japanese literature, fueled very much by an improved infrastructure and attitudes surrounding the translation sector. Now, coming back to translation, what does this all mean to study, all these translations? We'll hear soon from Joanna Sensei and Nana Sensei about their experience with Japanese language and culture. But by way of conclusion today, I'd like to also make the point that in as much as literature can teach us a lot about Japanese culture and all of that, ultimately, it does not only exist to serve a particular national paradigm. Literature serves, first and foremost, humanity, the human soul, human feelings, human consciousness, human perceptions of beauty. And so it is possible too, I think, to study translations of Japanese novels purely as literature, that is, as instances of great storytelling through the use of language, or as translations, that is, as endeavors of communication across different languages. And with this latest wave of translation, an interesting possibility has now emerged when some of the writers, for example, Murakami Haruki, their works are getting retranslated. For example, his 1985 novel, Hardball Wonderland and the End of the World, which you can see on the screen, was first translated into English in 1991 by Alfred Birnbaum. That's the translation you see on the left. Last year, however, it was retranslated into a new version by another translator, J. Rubin, and it's titled End of the World and Hardball Wonderland. It's the one that you can see on the right. We only need to turn to the very first paragraph of the very first chapter to appreciate the different nuances and styles of the two translations. Or if we further rearrange that and break them down into clusters, the differences in word choices and sentence rhythms also become apparent. Some of them are minute, of course, but for example, the one line that I've marked an asterisk on, just to the bottom of the screen, that is only one line, one line in the word in the Birnbaum translation on the left, but on the right in the Rubin translation, you can see it's a 4-line full elaboration in the new translation. Now, this paragraph doesn't necessarily have anything to do with Japanese society and culture, right? But simply by juxtaposing the two different translations, we can come to appreciate the different aesthetic choices made by the translators. Now, according to the translators afterward, J. Rubin was given the task by Murakami himself to produce this new translation because the earlier translation, the one on the left, had some cuts, and so it was an abridged version. Rubin himself recounts how in the 1990s, editors at Alfred K. Knopf asked him to cut down another Murakami's novel called The Wine Bird Chronicle, because Alfred K. Knopf determined that it wouldn't be able to sell well in its full length. This time, however, J. Rubin says, and I quote him, quote, "Now, however, more than 30 years later, the time is long past for a full-length translation of Haruki's great early masterpiece." End of quote. The most important word here for me is now. Now that Japanese literature is enjoying a new wave of translation, thanks partly to Murakami himself, now is finally the time when Murakami no longer has to kowtow to demands of editors or publishers in the UK or in the US, who in fact still hold a lot of power in deciding what works and which works get translated, published, and released to us public readers. And herein lies the last point I want to make in relation to our event today. This series of events organized by the Japan Foundation aims to entice you to study Japanese language and culture, either elsewhere or here at Leicester, and we shall hear from colleagues here at Leicester about the great programs they offer. A key benefit of mastering the Japanese language, therefore, is that you'll be able to enjoy Japanese literature in Japanese freely without being limited by market considerations of publishing houses or editors. You'll also be able to help translate some of your favorite Japanese literary works to more English-speaking readers. And by so doing, you get to play a part too in shaping the landscape of translation for Japanese literature in future. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your comments and sharing. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. It's so nice to see so many people here today, and I know we've got a lot of people at home as well. This is wonderful. So I'm Joanna, and I'm a librarian and a freelance Japanese to English literary translator based here in Leicester. And we've just heard Michael's wonderful talk about the development of Japanese literature in English and how it's booming recently. And what I'd like to do is kind of go behind the scenes and look at what's happening when we're translating Japanese into English, and particularly look at some of the challenges involved in translating Japanese literature into English, particularly those related to translating culture. And these are all challenges that I've come across myself when I'm translating. But before I go into the main part of my talk, I'd like to just talk for a minute about how I came to study Japanese and become a translator. So I really remember clearly the first time I met someone from Japan, because it was a long time ago. It was on my 7th birthday. At the time, my parents had some friends in Norway, and we were on holiday there. We were traveling around, and we picked up a young Japanese hitchhiker. He didn't speak very much English. He spoke a little bit. Nobody in my family spoke any Japanese at all, but we managed to communicate somehow, and I was really fascinated by this person from the other side of the world. But what really fascinated me was he spent the whole journey making origami. He made origami cranes, a bit like these ones, and he also made a little umbrella that you could actually sort of put up and put down. It was amazing. I was mesmerized. And when we dropped him off, he gave us these origami items as a present. And I think that must have sparked something, because when I got home to the UK, I went to the public library and I got a children's book about Japan out from the library. And there was a bit in it about the Japanese writing system, and that fascinated me. There was this character. This is originally a Chinese character. It means bridge. In Japanese, it's pronounced hashi. And I spent hours like copying it out until I could write it off by heart. And that was the first Japanese word I ever learned. I went on to study East Asian languages at university, and I traveled and studied and worked in China and Taiwan and Japan. And while I was a student, I was thinking about what to do next. And I really enjoyed the translation that we did as exercises as part of my course. But at that time, it was kind of pre-internet, and I wasn't sure how to become a translator. I didn't know where to start. It was difficult to network with other translators. So while I was thinking about what to do with my life, I got a part-time job in a library. And I ended up staying there. I enjoyed it. I liked speaking to students. I love being around books. But about 15 years ago, I felt pulled back to languages. And I started going to events like these ones organized by the Japan Foundation. They've also got some wonderful materials online. I started attending classes at languages at Leicester to revive my Japanese. And eventually it got good enough that during the pandemic, I did a master's in translation studies. And now I'm in the early stages of my career as a literary translator. And I think I'd like to end this part by saying that in my experience, it's never too late to start or go back to learning a language. So there are lots of challenges involved in translating Japanese to English. To mention just a few, grammatically, they're very different. Japanese doesn't always need to specify a person's gender. You don't need to use pronouns. It doesn't have gendered endings like some European languages. So sometimes the translator will have to make a decision about whether a character is he or she, or is it better to preserve the ambiguity in the text and use they, perhaps. Japanese nouns don't necessarily need to be marked as singular or plural. So again, if you're translating a scene in a garden, it's not necessarily obvious to the translator whether it's a tree or trees. You'll have to make a choice sometimes. Sometimes there'll be clues in the text, and very rarely it may be possible for the translators to speak to the original author, but usually that's not possible, so the translator will have to make that decision. Another issue is that Japanese has many levels of polite language. We have similarities in English, but the way polite language is used is not exactly the same. And it might come across differently to an English-speaking audience. It might evoke an old-fashioned or a posh setting, which it wouldn't necessarily do for Japanese readers. And then things like wordplay that depend on the sounds of language, they can be really difficult to replicate. There are so many challenges I could talk about, but today I'm going to focus on just one, and that's culturally specific items. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, translation is not just a case of substituting a word in one language for a word in another. It's more about translating ideas rather than individual words. And ideas are, of course, rooted in culture. And this can cause issues for the translator when there's a concept that doesn't have an exact equivalent in the language that you're translating into. In translation studies, the technical term for these concepts are culturally specific items, sometimes CSIs for short. And that's exactly, it says what it says in the tin, the items which are culturally specific. So they could be things like, in the photographs there, things like clothing, food and drink, festivals, traditions, institutions that exist in Japan, but not necessarily in the UK or other English-speaking areas. So they could also be things like people or places that have connotations for a Japanese audience, but not necessarily for an English one. So an example that came up in an exercise I did in my translation studies course when we were translating an article about Japanese education policy was the place named Kasumigaseki. Now, that's where government ministries are based. It's an area in central Tokyo. So to a Japanese reader, it sort of implies the Japanese government, the Japanese bureaucracy. But to an English-speaking audience, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's a little bit like how we use Whitehall to mean the British government bureaucracy or civil service, or we use the White House to mean the American presidency. So it's a translator's job to decide how much help the reader of the translation is going to need to make sense of these terms so that the reader can enjoy the translation. And the translator also has to work out how they're going to give that help. And there are several strategies a translator can use. They all have their advantages and disadvantages, and I'm going to look at 4. So one is to use footnotes or a glossary. This is an example of a footnote from Edward Seidensticker's translation of a famous Japanese novel, The Makioka Sisters by Junichiro Tanizaki. So the footnote says, balls of vinegared rice, highly seasoned, and usually topped with strips of raw or cooked fish. So I'm wondering, can anyone guess what that's going to be? Sorry? It could be something a bit more fishy, maybe. Sushi, yes, yes. Yeah. So this is the actual part of the novel where he says, where the footnote is put in after the word sushi. So these days, you know, sushi, you can find that in any local supermarket. And in fact, the word sushi has been in the Oxford English Dictionary for more than 30 years. So these days, a translator might not feel the need to add any extra explanation or a footnote or anything like that. But back in 1957, when Seidensticker's translation was published, it's likely very few readers would have been familiar with sushi unless they had a connection with Japan. And this demonstrates an important point, I think, that what's regarded as a culturally specific item changes over time and with different audiences. The advantage of footnotes or glossaries is that they preserve the local flavor of the text, but without adding anything into it or interrupting the flow for the reader, because the reader doesn't have to refer to the glossary or the footnotes if they don't want to. At the same time, they draw attention to a word, so they perhaps give it more emphasis than it did in the original. They also tend to be regarded as rather academic and more suitable for books where the translation is going to be studied rather than read for enjoyment. So saying, they are sometimes used in popular fiction. So I recently read Sam Bett's translation. It's a really powerful translation of The Night of Baba Yaga by Akira Otani. This is very much not an academic text. It's a thriller. It's very violent. It's very exciting. I would say it's a feminist Yakuza novel, the Yakuza, like the Japanese mafia. And it won a Dagger Prize for Best Fiction and Translation from the Crime Writers Association last year. And this book has some footnotes to explain some of the colourful insults that the Japanese gangsters use. But I think it's worth noting that both in this book and in the Makioka Sisters, footnotes are used very sparingly. And I think that's probably the way to go in, you know, a non-academic text. Another way to deal with CSIs is to add some explanation within the text. So this is an example from my own translation of a short essay that was published last year in a local literary anthology. The information underlined isn't in the Japanese text. The Japanese text just says, grandmother often told us stories about Tengu and Umebozu. So a Japanese reader would have a mental image of both of these supernatural creatures. The photo is of a Tengu. That an English-speaking reader wouldn't necessarily have. So by adding a bit of additional information, I'm trying to help the reader of the translation to understand that the grandmother is telling spooky folk tales. And Nakaya, the author, goes on to talk about these creatures' connection to the area he grew up in. So this information is quite important. Again, though, it's probably best to use this technique as sparingly as possible, because the translator's adding something that's not in the original, which could perhaps distort the meaning. So in this case, perhaps I've sort of highlighted a contrast or between the Tengu, who generally live in the mountains, and the Umbozu, who live in the sea, or in this case, it's a lagoon next to the sea, that wasn't necessarily the author's intention. And this is kind of the translator's dilemma. You want to help the reader of the translation to have an experience that's as close as possible to that the original readers would have had, and to enjoy what they're reading and to understand it. But at the same time, you want to remain faithful to the author's original creation. A third strategy is to use a generic word. This is an example from another fabulous translation by Emily Balistrieri of The Night is Short, Walk On Girl by Tomohiko Morimi. Again, it's a popular book. It has a lot of culturally specific items in it. And in this case, Balistrieri has chosen to translate furoshiki tsutsumi, which is something wrapped in a traditional furoshiki wrapping cloth that might look something like the picture at the top, as simply bundle. And I think this is a good solution when the word, as in this case, isn't particularly significant to the story, and we're adding extra information will make the sentence long and unwieldy. Another example, and this is not from The Night is Short, is the word chankonabe, which is a kind of hearty stew traditionally served to sumo wrestlers. You could just translate that as stew. The downside of this strategy is that it slightly flattens the translation. It removes some of the distinctive Japanese flavor. And finally, the translator can choose to use the Japanese word without any additional explanation. And these 4 examples come from Sam Bett's translation of The Night of Baba Yaga again, which again has a lot of CSIs. So in this translation, as you can see in these 4 examples, Japanese words are sometimes used and they aren't even put into italics. It may be that you could actually find some of these words in an English dictionary, but I'm not necessarily sure that everybody would know what they mean. But I think it's obvious from context that a tanto is a type of knife, seiza is a sitting position, mugicha is a drink, and fusuma sliding screens or doors. This solution is really great for succinctness, and it preserves the Japaneseness of the setting. And I think there's increasingly a feeling that these days where it's very easy for people to look up what a word means just by Googling it, that you don't necessarily need to put in a lot of explanation. But again, readers might find if there's a lot of words they're not familiar with, that's a bit off-putting. Or I know I don't speak German, so if I read a book that's got a lot of German terms in it, I feel like I'm missing something, or I feel like it's interrupting the flow of reading. So I've kind of been through 4 different strategies. We've looked at footnotes and glossary, adding extra information in the text, using a generic word and using the Japanese word without any additional explanation. I'd quite like to ask the audience, what do you think? What's your preferred solution? And I know that we've got lots of people joining us online, so please also have a think. And would anyone like to have a preference, would like to state their preference? Yes. Glossary. You prefer a glossary, okay? That's yeah. I have actually read popular books recently that have glossaries, and it can be a good strategy because you can consult it when you want to, but you don't necessarily have to. Anybody else? Yeah. You prefer when it's added into the text, a little bit of extra explanation added into text, but I think it has to be subtle. I think you don't want it to be too too much explanation can kind of get in the way. So in reality, translators will use a variety of techniques depending on the circumstances. Some decisions, I think, as Michael referred to, may be taken out of the translator's hands. Publishers or editors may have a view, and editors have been known to add some not so subtle explanation into the text, which I would question whether that's necessary these days when readers can Google things for themselves. I think ultimately the most important thing is to keep the audience in mind. In a translation of a historical text for a readership is going to be studying it in detail, it would be appropriate to have footnotes or glossaries, but not usually a manga translation. And a translation of a novel for a general readership might need a bit more explanation than, say, a Japanese light novel, a popular genre novel that's going to be read by people that have an interest and a good knowledge of Japanese popular culture. for me, making these judgments and coming up with different solutions to the challenges of culturally specific items is one of the things I find fascinating about translation and why I enjoy it so much. And I think by looking at the issues around culturally specific items, it makes it clear that when we're translating, we're not simply translating words, we're also translating culture. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, good evening, everybody. Konbanwa. Well, I actually prefer speaking Japanese, but today I'm going to have to speak in English. My name is Nana Sato-Rossberg. I'm teaching translation studies at SOAS University of London. Today I've got mission to talk about Japanese society in Japanese literature. I've got 15 minutes, a little bit more, 20 is okay? Okay, I'm just worried about time. I'm going to try to speak this kind of very difficult aspect in 20 minutes, okay? So, as already Mike-san nicely summarized how Japanese literature, kind of translated literature wave came to, for example, England. 3 waves he explained, and that was very well summarized. So I have nothing to add on that. And then Joanna-san nicely explained how it's difficult to translate actually 2 very different, cultures and languages. But it's also great because those cultural items, how we can translate, that's main 3 methods we normally use depending on the purpose. So, for example, already Mike-san mentioned all these 3 books. And maybe you've read those books already, I guess. Okay, so then what are the trendy keywords and themes? Okay, so Mike-san talked about some sort of trendy waves, but then what's the 3rd wave of Japanese novels? Why they attract so many foreign people? Foreign, okay? I have to put this to foreign. So the keywords also Mike-san mentioned already are cats, cafes, means coffee shops, bookstores, libraries. So I was born in Japan, grew up there, and now I've been teaching here in the UK for 15 years. So I know about the UK a little bit. I think it's okay to say, I think many people who live in the UK like cafes. Am I right? They like to go to cafe, drinking coffee, and then reading maybe Japanese novels. Same for, I could say, people who live in Japan. They love cafes. I love cafes. Go there. I just don't do anything, but maybe listening music and then just drinking coffee and thinking about many things. Bookstores, yes, because we are scholars or you are students. Maybe you must like bookstores or libraries. And the cats, I'm not so sure because I'm a dog person, but when I recently learned from Japanese TV that in the past, many Japanese people loved dogs rather than cats, but recently, more Japanese younger people love cats. Do you know why? Lots of possibilities? Okay. That's also a good answer. What I learned is that many, especially young Japanese people, feel that cats look like very free, but dogs are more like domesticated. And apparently, young Japanese feel they're not really free. They have to always follow many rules and then, many things. So when they have cats, they feel like, oh, cats are so free. So they can kind of feel like, oh, my dream is there in cats because I'm not free, but cats are free. Apparently, that's the reason. Don't you think it's interesting? Right. But I'm still a dog person. That means maybe I feel I'm relatively free. Okay. So apparently, common setting for the popular Japanese novels, which were translated a lot into English, for example, it's urban life. Those settings are all somewhat like a city side, okay? So like maybe I've read recently some story and they didn't say where it's about, but I could imagine that's a cafe in maybe Tokyo, possibly Osaka. But the atmosphere I got was probably this cafe is in Tokyo, but they didn't specify, okay? But I can feel that. Maybe when you go to a cafe, when you think something, maybe a cafe is one space where you feel like it doesn't matter where you are, you know, can be Tokyo, can be London, can be Leicester, but it's cafe. Cafe is cafe, which is a shared venue for all the people. So they can feel kind of a sympathy if the story is set in a cafe. You can imagine what it's like. I found it very interesting. And apparently some people who like Japanese novels say, it's not really about my home country, and it's somewhere in East Asia. So we know it's different from my place or my space, but then there are so many things that in common, that I feel it's in common, like a cafe. I love a cafe, and apparently this writer loves also cafe. It's very interesting. Also, many Japanese recent novels write about what they feel about their life, regrets, or memory with their family. And other keyword come up with is ikizurasa. This is a very common word for many, many Japanese young people. It's hard to keep life going because future is uncertain, right? Even at my age, I feel like my future, it's uncertain. You know that when I think about 5 years later, I'm not so sure, right? Ikizurasa. So that's apparently one very important keyword, which actually many younger people share. And that's why they feel sympathy to Japanese novels. So Mike-san also mentioned Convenience Store Woman, written by Murata Sayaka. Interestingly, she was really working in the convenience store. And possibly even now, I'm not so sure. Anyway, so this convenience store woman actually talking about ikizurasa, particularly for female in Japan. The protagonist, she was 36-year-old woman, Keiko Furukawa, and she's working at the convenience store for 18 years. 18 years, it's quite a long time. And she's not married. So in Japan, it's already, I can imagine as same gender, it's probably very difficult. Today, I'm not so sure, maybe today it's easier. But if you're female, not married, and working at a convenience store for 18 years, and if you're 36-year-old, it's going to be very difficult in Japan. And so she's not considered as normal female Japanese. Why? Because society expects female to be married maybe up to 30 nowadays, having a baby maybe until 36-year-old. Working at the convenience store for 18 years is not very normal. That's the protagonist in this book. But she finds how normality working in a convenience store because she likes following the rules and she likes this systematic life. And actually, what a coincidence. I was working at a convenience store for 10 years actually. And one of my colleagues, when she read Convenience Store Woman, she came to me and said, Nana, have you read that book? What book? Convenience Store Woman. Right. That protagonist is like you. That's what she said. And I said, oh my God, okay, I should read the book. And after I read this book, I wasn't sure if I'm like this person. But anyway, that was what my colleagues said to me. So once this Keiko-san tried to go out the world of convenience store, she found a boyfriend and tried to become a normal female. But in the end, she started to question, what does being normal mean? Do you know what does being normal? What does it mean? Who judge you? Who decide what is normal, what is not normal? Anyway, so this story is very interesting because actually this story talks about difficulty for Japanese female to live in a sort of abnormal life. So ikizurasa for women are often discussed. And now even Japanese government try to make it right. But also male says that, they say also that, oh, wait a moment, male also have a difficulty, ikizurasa, to live. Because in Japan, many people expect male to have a proper job. At some point, you should marry and have kids. So many male feel pressure to be like man. So why we can't be just free? Then don't pursue any normality, because I don't think anybody, I mean, you know, people are different, right? People can be different. And I mean, normality somewhat pressure you to be in some sort of box, right? That's why people feel it's ikizurai. But anyway, many recent Japanese novels are talking about also ikizurasa, which actually common feeling in the UK too, especially for younger people, perhaps. That's why apparently they find it's so interesting to read Japanese books, because this is actually what I feel. And even a very far place like Japan, now 14 hours flight to be in Japan, apparently they feel the same. So they feel sort of like, okay, it's very interesting to read those recent Japanese novels. So ordinary. This is the Japanese sort of notion of ordinary, the state of being commonplace, found anywhere and at any time, the state of possessing no particularly distinctive qualities. This is the ordinary, I mean, notion of ordinarity in Japan. I personally prefer to be a little bit distinctive, different from others. And I'm sure actually you all are different from others. And probably that's why Convenience Woman, written by Sayaka Murata, who tried to go beyond the box, outside of the box, it's probably people feel really interesting and they read it. Sorry, so I have to, Okay, so to summarize, why Japanese novels are popular? Because they share important keywords: cafe, coffee shops, bookstore, libraries, and cats. Urban life, but in the stories are from the West, sorry, from the East. Not the same, but not too different. Like 50 years ago, maybe when people say, I like Japanese novels, they were told you are Orientalist, for example. It's very different today. We feel something to share, and we feel similar. That's why people read also Japanese novels. The things many people feel in their everyday lives, ikizurasa, this is also apparently one of the things why people feel sympathy to Japanese novels. sorry, I had to rush. And thank you for joining the event. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me, ns27@soas.ac.uk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the question. I certainly wouldn't agree that wokeism is necessarily the best word for this. I think that as I was trying to gesture, even though it's the real picture is a lot more complex, I was just saying that there could be seen as having different waves. And so one way to think about this is that society changes, as Joanna was saying. Society also changes, and there will always be new ideas coming. People will adjust to new material conditions in society. The youth today and the youth 30 years ago are very different. And so I think one of the things we can think about it is in the context of the rise of translation or translated literature, perhaps there can be, I haven't looked too much into this, by the way, I should say, but I think that it makes sense to examine how the rise in the consumption of translation, how that is related to the terrible events that the entire globe has gone through in the last few years, including, for example, COVID. Right. So at times of desperations, where do people go for solace, for peace, right? And so one of the ways maybe to contextualize the rise in the consumption of translation is this idea to try to understand the world, the chaotic world that we're living in, and therefore looking outside of English literature and trying to learn a bit more about the world by reading literatures in other languages and other cultures. That doesn't obviously have to be just Japanese, obviously. So, you know, other translated literature also gets a lot of attention as well. But yeah, I would say that given the times that we're living in, perhaps there is something to be said about this desire to look outwards and try to understand, to build human connection, as my two colleagues have been saying today. You know, it's about building this kind of human connection. And this desire of building is of community, of network. I think it's very important in the current context. Any additions?
I mean, it did make me think of something that came up in my dissertation. So I was translating a piece by Yuriko Miyamoto, who was writing in the 1920s. And in her text, she uses kare, like meaning he, to mean sort of a person in general. So the traveler, he would see this or he would see that in Moscow. And I really debated whether to translate it as to turn it around, so I wasn't using he to mean sort of universal person, or whether I should keep it as he. But I looked back at sort of contemporary English writing by women, English writers in the 1920s, and they used he as a sort of universal pronoun. So I thought, in keeping with the kind of the contemporary feeling of the 1920s writing, I would keep it as he. And there were other reasons as well that I wouldn't go into, but I had to justify it in my commentary for my dissertation. So but the fact that you're sort of thinking about that shows that, you know, how contemporary mores affect like how things are translated.
I mean, I can very quickly make some observations to the extent that for a very long time, translation of anime and manga were done by very fervent fans, and so there would be translation groups, and these would follow very strictly the release schedule of a new episode of anime in Japan, which sometimes is aired in the small hours of the night. So they aired it in Japan, they got captured immediately, and then they got translated really quickly. And I'm not going to delve into the complexity of this issue. All I will say is that sometimes translation can be done by very passionate fans as well, and those fans would, in order to do justice to the Japanese context and the cultural elements, they would add a glossary. Going back to Joanna's 4 strategies, a lot of them would want to add a glossary very quickly at the top, for example, of the screen, while the dialogue is going on with the subtitles. At the bottom, they could add a very quick glossary at the top, for example. And this all is very much done out of a kind of love, if you want, for Japanese anime and culture.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really the demographic for manga and anime, so I kind of steered away from that kind of translation. But I mean, I don't know that much about it, but I think there are lots of commercial pressures, aren't there, that meaning things that are translated very quickly, even, getting away from the fan subbing kind of thing, that maybe machine translation is used, and I still think humans do a better job.
Higashino, okay. I don't think I can answer to your question, but what I know is that I'm not a great fan of Higashino-san. I'm so sorry to say. So that I watched a couple of films. Story was created by Higashino-san, but I'm not so sure. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I mean, just very quickly. First of all, I think Higashino Keigo's popularity in the East Asian market has to do with a lot of the film and TV adaptations of his Galileo series, which is an iconic, an iconic detective, and that detective uses scientific knowledge. He's a professor in science, scientific knowledge to solve cases, murder cases. I think the theatricality of adapting a murder mystery on screen is very appealing, and I think that kind of feeds into his kind of popularity, especially in the East Asian region, because that was adapted back in I think the 2000s and the 2010s. However, Higashino Keigo has a second detective character, and that is a lot more sociological. And so I was just thinking when you were asking that question that there's some space there to think about why, when Higashino Keigo tries to write in a more sociological way, as in talking about, dramatizing a murder mystery in the background, in the backdrop of Japanese social problems, why that still wasn't as famous as it could be. I mean, he is translated. I mean, I put a cover of his book up there, so he is translated. But he was also translated in the across the 2000s, I think, into English. And maybe that still wasn't necessarily the best time for this. I think now, in fact, there are more Japanese detective novels being translated into English. Matsumoto Seicho had been, right? So I think now maybe could have been a better chance. Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
So there is a concept, pre-translation. And Murakami Haruki is pretty famous doing that. So pre-translation means that while Murakami Haruki is writing his novel, he's already imagining how it's translated into English. So in his brain, he's writing English literature already. And it's also known that he's been longing for American culture. He loves American culture. And so by doing this pre-translation, I think he's already imagining what kind of audience he's dealing with, he's writing for. And he chooses translators carefully, and he often gives freedom to translators, changing the words or sentences so that it fits to more English style. And some of my students who was not learning Japanese or Japanese studies, but other languages, but loved Murakami Haruki. But they believed that Murakami Haruki is from the US, not from Japan. They believe that Murakami Haruki is writing in English. So I think that could be also something that's echoing.
No, I mean, I think that's absolutely spot on there. One of the things that Murakami is actually known for is that in his first novel, Hear the Wind Sing, he actually wrote the beginning in English first, and then he translated it back himself into Japanese. So the first draft was actually in English in the beginning, and then he self-translates back into Japanese. But it is true that Murakami has an amazing ability to think in English, in the English language, and I think that really helps the job of the translator. I mean, I can't say it obviously for sure, but I would imagine that it does make the English translation a bit easier to manage. At the same time, I feel that the one of the reasons why I think Murakami is so popular is very much related to Ikizurasa as well. I mean, he was also, a lot of it was talking about the Ikizurasa in Japan back in the 80s and 90s to some extent. And that is something that people in various contexts would be able to connect to, as evidenced by my colleagues this evening. So even if someone growing up in South Africa, South Africa has very complex and difficult histories as well. And I think a South African translator would still be able to convey some of that feeling. It might not be the exact same feeling to that particular detail, but that's the beauty of translation. Everyone will come up with your own translations, modulating in different ways.
We offer language courses here at Leicester for everybody, students and staff, because we believe in promoting cultures through the language. Yeah. So in our classes, people come and learn about the language as a window to reach different cultures. So I think that makes it pertinent to talk about that. Yeah. So if you want to find out about it, just Google Languages at Leicester, and you can see the courses we offer. Of course, we offer several courses in Japanese, which are quite popular, and those are a window to the cultures of each of the languages. So that's our invitation to all of you. Thank you very much.